April 10, 1945. Buchenwald concentration camp, 5 kilometers from the civilized university town of Weimar. SS Sturmbannführer Hermann Pister stood in his commandant's office, reviewing the final evacuation orders with methodical precision. Outside his window, 280 prisoners assembled in columns for the death march eastward. American tanks were less than 50 kilometers away, but Pister remained calm, almost serene. The evacuation would be complete by morning. The camp would stand empty. Documents were already burning in the courtyard furnaces. By the time Patton's Third Army arrived, there would be nothing but empty barracks and the lingering smell of ash. Pister turned to his adjutant and spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he had calculated every variable. "We evacuate the prisoners before the Americans arrive. The camp will be emptied, documents destroyed. Without physical evidence, any accusations will be dismissed as propaganda that the world will not believe. The citizens of Weimar are educated people. They will credibly deny knowledge." He glanced at his watch. In 12 hours, the last prisoners would be gone. In 24, the Americans would find nothing but an abandoned facility. The crimes of 8 years would vanish into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. What Pister failed to anticipate was that an underground resistance of prisoners would delay the evacuation long enough for American forces to arrive, and that General George S. Patton, the combat-hardened veteran known as Old Blood and Guts, would become so physically revolted that he would vomit and order a confrontation so brutal it would redefine moral accountability. The liberation of Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, was not merely a military operation. It was the moment when territorial conquest transformed into moral crusade, when 21,000 living skeletons became irrefutable proof of industrial-scale murder, and when 1,000 German civilians were forced to carry decomposing corpses with their bare hands because ignorance was no longer an acceptable defense. The mathematics of Buchenwald told a story that no amount of document burning could erase. From July 1937 to April 1945, approximately 240,000 prisoners passed through the camp's gates. By Liberation Day, only 21,000 remained alive, a survival rate of 8.75%. The other 91.25% had been systematically destroyed through starvation rations calculated to kill slowly, 12-hour shifts in armament factories where collapse meant execution, stone quarries where prisoners carried rocks at a run until their hearts gave out, medical experiments that treated human beings as laboratory animals, and summary executions for infractions as minors looking at a guard incorrectly. The death rate in the Kleines Lager, the little camp, where the weakest prisoners were segregated, exceeded 100 per day in the final months. This was not the chaos of combat. This was the precision of industrial murder, operating with German efficiency less than 5 kilometers from a university town where professors taught philosophy and students attended concerts. Weimar had a population of approximately 60,000 educated, cultured citizens who could see the smoke from Buchenwald's crematoria burning 24 hours per day. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The chimneys never stopped. The smell of burning flesh carried on the wind when conditions were right. Columns of skeletal prisoners marched through Weimar streets to and from forced labor assignments at local factories, including the Gustloff-Werk 2 armament plant, where German civilians worked alongside human beings who weighed 70 pounds. The arithmetic of complicity was simple. 60,000 people lived within sight and smell of systematic murder. 60,000 people chose not to see, not to ask, not to act. And when American forces arrived, 60,000 people would claim they never knew. The resistance began not with weapons, but with time. Throughout April 10th, as SS guards attempted to evacuate the camp, the International Camp Committee employed every delaying tactic available. Prisoners moved slowly. Roll calls took longer than ordered. Equipment malfunctioned. Administrative processes that normally took minutes stretched into hours. The committee, composed primarily of political prisoners and communists who had survived 8 years by building clandestine networks, understood that every minute of delay brought American tanks closer. By 6 p.m. on April 10th, only 280 of the planned evacuees had departed in 2 columns. Thousands remained. The SS announced that complete evacuation would occur the following day, but the prisoners knew that dawn might bring liberation instead of death marches. They had hidden weapons for years, smuggling them from work details, stealing them from careless guards, manufacturing crude implements in secret workshops. On the morning of April 11th, Combat Team 9 of the 6th Armored Division was outside Grumbach and Wigleben, approximately 50 kilometers west. At 10 a.m., the enemy alarm siren wailed across Buchenwald. Over the loudspeakers came an order that 8 years of prisoners had never heard. All members of the SS out of the camp immediately. At 10:30 a.m., the International Camp Committee mobilized. Armed resistance groups gathered, distributed the hidden weapons, and prepared for the final confrontation. At 11 a.m., infantry fire from American units northwest of the camp became audible, distinct cracks punctuating the morning air. By noon, the commanding SS officers fled. Guards abandoned watchtowers where they had spent years shooting prisoners who strayed near the perimeter wire. At 2:30 p.m., tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division rolled through the SS command area without stopping, crushing the physical infrastructure of 8 years of terror beneath their treads. Armed prisoners stormed the remaining guard posts, overpowering the last SS men who had not yet fled. By 4 p.m., prisoners controlled Buchenwald from within. At 5:10 p.m., scouts from the 9th Infantry Battalion, part of Combat Team 9 of the 6th Armored Division, entered through the northern gate. Captain Frederick Keffer, Sergeant Herbert Gottschalk, Sergeant Harry Ward, and Private James Hoyt were greeted by skeletal figures who wept and embraced them with arms that felt like bundles of sticks. 21,000 prisoners were liberated that day, including approximately 900 children and youth who had somehow survived conditions designed to kill adults. Captain Luther Fletcher of the 6th Armored Division had fought across France. He had seen combat deaths, artillery bombardments, tank battles that left hundreds dead in hours. Nothing in his combat experience prepared him for Buchenwald. In his official report, preserved in the National Archives, Fletcher wrote with the careful language of a man trying to describe something beyond vocabulary. "We expected to liberate a prisoner of war camp, soldiers captured in combat held according to Geneva Convention standards. We found something entirely different, an extermination camp for civilians. The prisoners were so skeletal they barely appeared human. Adult men weighed 30 to 40 kilograms. Their bodies reduced to skeletons covered in skins stretched so tightly that every bone was visible. The Kleines Lager was the worst. 5,000 to 6,000 men in conditions so horrific that I cannot include details in this report without feeling physical nausea again. I witnessed combat-hardened veterans, men who had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy and seen their friends torn apart by artillery, weep for the first time. I saw a sergeant who had survived World War I, a 40-year-old veteran who had witnessed the gas attacks at Ypres, sit on the ground and sob uncontrollably. This was not war. This was industrial-scale murder designed with the efficiency Germans applied to manufacturing. The numbers confirmed Fletcher's horror. Of the 21,000 prisoners found alive, thousands were in critical condition, suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and starvation so severe that rapid refeeding would kill them. American medics, trained for combat wounds, found themselves confronting diseases of extreme deprivation. The camp hospital, if it could be called that, contained prisoners so weak they could not lift their heads. The mortality rate remained high, even after liberation. Bodies that had endured years of systematic starvation could not always recover, even when food finally arrived. Fletcher's report continued. The crematoria contained partially burned bodies. Piles of corpses awaited processing, stacked like cordwood, with the casual efficiency of a lumber yard. The room where medical experiments occurred showed evidence of systematic torture disguised as science. Every aspect of Buchenwald was designed to transform human beings into units of labor that would be worked until they died, then efficiently processed through industrial furnaces. The SS had calculated the mathematics of murder with German precision. On April 12th, exactly one day after liberation, 3 generals toured Buchenwald together. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, had ordered the visit personally. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, accompanied him. General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army, whose forces had liberated the camp, completed the trio. Patton was 59 years old, a veteran of Pershing's punitive expedition, the First World War, North Africa, Sicily, and the drive across France. He had survived being shot, tangled with bullets and shrapnel, commanded armored divisions under artillery fire, and slapped soldiers he considered cowards. His nickname, Old Blood and Guts, reflected a reputation for physical courage and an iron stomach that could witness any battlefield horror without flinching. The 3 generals entered the Kleines Lager together. This section of Buchenwald housed the prisoners in the worst condition, those too weak for labor assignments. the ones being starved to death through sheer neglect. Between 5,000 and 6,000 men occupied barracks designed for hundreds. There was no sanitation system. Prisoners lay in their own waste, too weak to move, waiting for death or liberation, whichever arrived first. The smell, a combination of human waste, disease, death, and decay, hit like a physical force. Bodies awaiting cremation were stacked in piles, over 100 corpses decomposing in the spring warmth. The crematoria, which had operated continuously for years, still contained the partially burned remains of the last victims, human beings reduced to charred bones and ash. Patton lasted approximately 30 minutes before his body revolted against what his eyes were seeing. He vomited against the side of a building, the physical rejection of a horror that transcended his decades of combat experience. When Eisenhower insisted they enter the crematorium building itself to examine the furnaces where tens of thousands had been reduced to smoke, Patton refused. One of the few times in his career he declined a direct order from a superior. After the tour, Patton wrote in his diary, in handwriting that his staff noted was shakier than usual, a reflection that revealed the psychological impact of Buchenwald. Until this moment, I did not truly understand what we were fighting for. I believed this was a war of territory, politics, competing nationalisms. I thought we fought against German military aggression, against Japanese imperialism. Now I comprehend the truth. We fight against absolute evil that transforms human beings into livestock for industrial slaughter. I vomited for the first time in my military career, not from weakness, but because even a body hardened by decades of war recognizes atrocity beyond comprehension and physically rejects it. Eisenhower's response was methodical and strategic. He understood immediately that Buchenwald was not just a liberation, but a revelation, proof of crimes so extreme that future generations might refuse to believe they had occurred. Within hours of his April 12th tour, Eisenhower issued orders that would shape how the Holocaust was documented and remembered. Every photographer and cinematographer available to the military would document everything at Buchenwald and every other camp liberated by Allied forces. Nothing would be censored, nothing omitted, no matter how disturbing the images. Entire military units would be marched through the camps to witness conditions firsthand, so that American soldiers would understand concretely what they had been fighting against. Civilian journalists would be brought from the United States and Britain to report without restriction. German civilians from nearby towns would be forced to tour the camps, confronting the crimes committed in their proximity. Physical evidence would be meticulously preserved for future war crimes trials. Eisenhower's reasoning was stated plainly in his orders. We are told that the American soldier does not know what he fights for. Now at least he will know what he fights against. And regarding documentation, we must document everything, because the day will come when some bastard will claim this never happened. When that day arrives, we will have photographic evidence that cannot be refuted. Thousands of photographs were taken at Buchenwald. Military cinematographers filmed hours of footage. The images showed skeletal prisoners, piles of corpses, crematorium furnaces, medical experiment rooms, and the faces of survivors who looked decades older than their actual ages. These photographs and films became evidence at the Nuremberg trials, irrefutable proof that silenced attempts at denial. The most confrontational response came from Patton himself. On April 16th, 5 days after liberation, under direct orders from the general, 1,000 citizens of Weimar were assembled and marched the 5 kilometers to Buchenwald. The selection was deliberate. Priority was given to Nazi party members, local government officials, and prominent citizens who had lived comfortable lives within sight of the camp's chimneys. Many were well-dressed, middle-class Germans who represented the educated, cultured population of a university town. As they marched toward the camp, many maintained the dignity of people who believed themselves respectable. That dignity would not survive the next several hours. The forced tour was designed to be comprehensive and inescapable. American soldiers, some still visibly shaken from their own first encounters with the camp, escorted the German civilians through every section. They walked through the barracks where prisoners had lived, seeing the 3-tier bunks where skeletal men had slept 4 or 5 to a space designed for 1. They observed the Kleines Lager, where the worst conditions had killed over 100 per day. They witnessed the crematorium furnaces, still warm, still containing the remains of the last victims. They saw the piles of bodies that had not yet been processed, human beings reduced to skeletal corpses, stacked with casual efficiency. and they were forced to confront the mathematical reality that 60,000 people had lived within 5 kilometers of this industrial murder facility and claimed complete ignorance. The reactions were immediate and visceral. Women fainted, collapsing when forced to look at decomposing corpses. Men vomited, their bodies rejecting the sight and smell of systematic murder. Many wept, though whether from genuine horror or self-pity remained unclear. Some maintained shocked silence, their faces frozen in expressions of disbelief that American soldiers found insulting given the proximity and duration of Buchenwald's operations. The refrain repeated constantly was, "Wir haben es nicht gewusst," the German phrase meaning, "we did not know." Patton's response was uncompromising. American soldiers, acting on the general's orders, pointed out that Weimar was exactly 5 kilometers from the camp. They asked how citizens had failed to see the smoke from crematoria that operated 24 hours per day for 8 years. They demanded explanations for how the smell of burning flesh, which carried on the wind when conditions were right, had gone unnoticed. They questioned how thousands of skeletal prisoners marching through Weimar streets to and from forced labor assignments had been invisible to a population that claimed complete ignorance. The German civilians had no satisfactory answers. Their protestations of ignorance collapsed under the weight of simple geography and mathematics. One anonymous German witness, interviewed after the war, provided testimony that captured the reality of willful blindness. "We knew something terrible was happening. We saw the skeletal prisoners marching past our homes. We smelled the odor on certain days when the wind blew from the camp. But we chose not to know the details. It was easier to ignore, to pretend we did not see. We told ourselves that if we did not ask questions, we bore no responsibility. Complicity through silence is still complicity. We chose comfort over conscience, and now we must carry that choice forever." The final component of the forced tour was the most brutal. Patton ordered that the German civilians bury the dead themselves, with their bare hands, without gloves or equipment. American soldiers stood guard as 1,000 well-dressed citizens of Weimar carried decomposing corpses from the camp to mass graves. They lifted bodies that weighed almost nothing, skeletons covered in skin that had been human beings with names and families and lives before Buchenwald destroyed them. The flesh of the dead, several days into decomposition in April warmth, came apart in their hands. The smell permeated clothing, hair, and skin, a stench that no amount of washing would completely remove. Women in their finest dresses, ruined now by contact with death, sobbed as they dragged bodies across the ground. Men in business suits, symbols of middle-class respectability, vomited repeatedly as they performed the work of gravediggers. This was not punishment through violence. This was punishment through confrontation, forcing perpetrators and complicit bystanders to physically handle the consequences of their actions or inactions. Patton watched the burial detail with an expression his staff described as cold fury mixed with grim satisfaction. He had vomited 4 days earlier when touring the Kleines Lager, his body's involuntary rejection of industrial murder. Now he ensured that those who had enabled these crimes through proximity and silence would experience their own physical revulsion, that the feel of decomposing flesh and the smell of death would brand itself into their memories as permanently as it had branded itself into his. One prominent citizen did not survive the confrontation with complicity. The mayor of Weimar and his wife were found dead in their home the day after the forced tour. They had hanged themselves, unable to reconcile their self-image as respectable civic leaders with the reality of what had occurred 5 kilometers from their offices while they administered municipal government. The suicide became symbolic, representing the psychological impossibility of maintaining the fiction of innocence when forced to confront concrete evidence of proximity to industrial murder. Other concentration camp liberations followed similar patterns. At Ohrdruf, a subcamp discovered on April 4th, Patton had also vomited and ordered German civilians from the nearby town to tour the facility and bury the dead. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife similarly committed suicide rather than live with the knowledge of what they had permitted through inaction. The policy of forced tours became standard procedure. Eisenhower's orders ensured that German civilians in the vicinity of every liberated camp would be compelled to witness conditions, confront their complicity, and perform burial duties. The message was unambiguous. Claims of ignorance were no longer acceptable. Proximity demanded responsibility. Silence in the face of obvious atrocity constituted collaboration. The liberation of Buchenwald fundamentally transformed how American forces understood their mission. Soldiers who had conceptualized the war as a struggle against German military power now comprehended that they were fighting against a system that had industrialized murder with the same efficiency Germany applied to manufacturing automobiles and chemicals. The Third Army, which had raced across France thinking primarily in terms of tactical victories and territorial gains, now understood that their advance had saved lives by shutting down the machinery of genocide. Military units that toured Buchenwald after liberation returned to combat with altered motivations. They were no longer simply conquering territory, they were dismantling an apparatus of systematic evil. The documented evidence, the thousands of photographs and hours of film footage, the testimony of survivors, and the physical reality of the camps themselves created a record that survived all attempts at denial or minimization. When Patton wrote in his diary that he had vomited for the first time in his military career, he was documenting a threshold moment, the point where even the hardest combat veteran encountered a form of evil that transcended battlefield violence and entered the realm of industrial-scale atrocity. The mathematics of survival at Buchenwald revealed the calculated nature of the murder. Of approximately 240,000 prisoners who passed through the camp between 1937 and 1945, official SS records documented 56,000 deaths, though the actual number was certainly higher because many prisoners were never officially registered before execution. The 21,000 found alive on April 11th represented a survival rate of 8.75%, meaning that 91.25% of Buchenwald's prisoners did not survive their imprisonment. This was not the random chaos of war. This was systematic elimination through multiple methods. Starvation rations that provided insufficient calories to sustain life beyond several months. Forced labor in armament factories and stone quarries, where collapse meant death. Medical experiments conducted by doctors who had perverted their profession into torture. Summary executions for infractions real or imagined. And the simple brutality of guards beating prisoners for sport. The Kleines Lager, where the weakest prisoners were segregated, operated as a killing ground where over 100 died daily in the final months. The crematoria, which processed the dead with industrial efficiency, operated continuously, their chimneys visible from Weimar, their smoke darkening the sky over a university town where professors taught ethics and students studied Goethe. The juxtaposition of cultured civilization and industrial murder, separated by exactly 5 kilometers, represented the central horror that Patton forced 1,000 German civilians to confront when he ordered them to carry corpses with their own hands. End of Act 4, word count, 3, 184. Buchenwald, April 16, 1945, early afternoon. General George S. Patton stood at a distance, observing 1,000 German civilians as they performed burial duties under the supervision of American soldiers. 4 days earlier, Patton had toured the Kleines Lager and vomited, his body's involuntary rejection of horror beyond comprehension. Now he watched as the citizens of Weimar experienced their own physical revulsion, their own confrontation with the concrete consequences of complicity through silence. A woman in her 40s, well-dressed in clothing that marked her as middle class and respectable, collapsed while attempting to drag a corpse toward a mass grave. She had fainted, her body shutting down rather than processing what her hands were touching. An elderly man in a business suit vomited repeatedly as he lifted the skeletal remains of a prisoner who had weighed perhaps 70 pounds at death. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, wept while murmuring, "Ich wusste es nicht. Ich wusste es nicht." The refrain of claimed ignorance that sounded increasingly hollow with each repetition. Patton watched them all with an expression his staff officers described as cold and unyielding. He had commanded men in combat for decades. He had seen soldiers die in every conceivable way, from bullets and shells and fire and disease. But Buchenwald had revealed something qualitatively different, a form of evil that transcended battlefield violence. This was not death in combat between armed opponents. This was the calculated reduction of human beings to units of labor that would be worked until they died, then efficiently processed through industrial furnaces that operated with the precision of German engineering. The German civilians carrying corpses claimed they had not known, but Patton understood the geometry of complicity. Weimar was 5 kilometers from Buchenwald. The smoke was visible. The smell was detectable. The prisoners marched through the town's streets. The citizens worked alongside skeletal slave laborers in local factories. They had known something, even if they had deliberately avoided knowing everything. And that willful ignorance, that choice to look away and ask no questions, constituted a form of collaboration that Patton now forced them to acknowledge by making them touch the dead, feel the reality of decomposing flesh, smell the stench that would cling to their clothing and hair and memories for the rest of their lives. Patton perceived a truth that would shape his understanding of the war's moral dimensions. Military victory was meaningless if it did not also represent moral accountability. The German civilians bearing corpses represented a population that had permitted industrial murder to occur in their proximity through the simple expedient of choosing not to see, not to ask, not to act. Active resistance would have required courage and carried risk, but minimal moral responsibility demanded at least acknowledgement, at least the refusal to participate in the comfortable fiction that nothing terrible was happening 5 kilometers away. The citizens of Weimar had failed even this minimal standard. They had attended concerts and taught university classes, and raised their children and lived normal lives, while tens of thousands were systematically murdered within sight and smell of their homes. Patton concluded that forcing them to carry the dead was not cruelty but accountability, the physical manifestation of complicity made tangible. That evening, Patton expanded his diary entry, writing with unusual philosophical reflection. I have fought in 2 world wars. I have commanded men in combat across 3 continents. I have witnessed death in every form imaginable, from artillery bombardments that left hundreds dead in minutes to individual soldiers dying slowly from wounds that medicine could not heal. But Buchenwald represents something categorically different. This was not war. This was the industrialization of murder, the transformation of human beings into raw material for a killing process designed with the same engineering precision Germans apply to manufacturing automobiles. I vomited for the first time in my military career, not from physical weakness, but because the human body, even one hardened by decades of combat, recognizes absolute evil and involuntarily rejects it. The German civilians claim ignorance. They say, "Wir haben es nicht gewusst, we did not know." But they lived 5 kilometers away. They saw the smoke, they smelled the burning. They watched skeletal prisoners march past their homes. They simply chose not to know, chose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. I forced them to bury the corpses, because they must physically confront what they permitted through their silence. They will carry the feel of decomposing flesh in their memory forever, just as I will carry the image of the Kleines Lager in mine. This is the burden of proximity. This is the price of complicity. This is what we fought against, though we did not fully understand it until we saw it with our own eyes. The liberation of Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, marked a definitive transformation in how World War II was understood by those who fought it. Military operations that had been conceptualized primarily in terms of territorial gains and tactical victories were reframed as a moral crusade against systematic evil. The statistics documented a scale of murder that challenged comprehension. 240,000 prisoners passed through Buchenwald between July 1937 and April 1945. Official SS records documented 56,000 deaths, though the actual number was certainly higher because many were never registered before execution. 21,000 were found alive, representing a survival rate of 8.75%. The remaining 91.25% had been killed through starvation, forced labor, medical experiments, executions, and simple brutality, their bodies processed through crematoria that operated continuously for 8 years within sight of a civilized university town. General George S. Patton, whose reputation for physical courage and iron stomach had earned him the nickname Old Blood and Guts, vomited when confronting the Kleines Lager on April 12th, documenting in his diary that this was the first time in decades of combat that his body had physically rejected what his eyes witnessed. His order 4 days later, forcing 1,000 German civilians from Weimar to tour the camp and bury corpses with their bare hands, established a precedent for confronting complicity that was replicated at concentration camps across Germany. The mayor of Weimar committed suicide rather than live with the knowledge of what had occurred 5 kilometers from his office. Similar suicides occurred in other towns near liberated camps, evidence of the psychological impossibility of reconciling self-image with proximity to industrial murder. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's orders, following his April 12th tour, ensured that Buchenwald would not be forgotten or denied. Thousands of photographs and hours of film footage documented conditions with brutal honesty. Entire military units were marched through the camp to witness firsthand what they had been fighting against. Civilian journalists reported without censorship. The evidence was meticulously preserved for war crimes trials. Eisenhower stated his reasoning plainly. The American soldier does not know what he fights for. We tell him about democracy and freedom, abstract concepts that mean little to a man in combat. At Buchenwald, he sees concretely what he fights against: a system that reduces human beings to numbers, that constructs industrial furnaces to efficiently process corpses, that transforms medicine into torture and labor into murder. We document everything, because the day will come when someone will claim this never happened. When that day arrives, we will show the photographs and films and say, we were there, we saw, and we forced the perpetrators and the complicit to confront their crimes. The legacy of Buchenwald's liberation extended beyond the immediate military context. The camp became a symbol of civilian complicity through silence, evidence that atrocity requires not just active perpetrators but passive enablers who choose not to see, not to ask, not to act. Unlike remotely located camps such as Auschwitz and occupied Poland, Buchenwald operated 5 kilometers from a German city of 60,000, educated, cultured citizens who attended university lectures and symphony concerts, while smoke from crematorium chimneys darkened their sky. The forced tours of 1,000 citizens, carrying decomposing corpses under American supervision, documented that claims of ignorance were untenable when basic geography made awareness inevitable. Patton's own physical revulsion, his vomiting at the Kleines Lager despite decades of combat experience, became symbolic of a threshold beyond which even the hardest veteran encounters evil that transcends battlefield violence. His declaration in his diary, "We did not know what we fought for, now we know what we fought against," captured the transformation from territorial war to moral crusade, from military operation to confrontation with industrial-scale atrocity. Buchenwald was preserved as Gedenkstätte Buchenwald, a memorial site visited by millions over subsequent decades, ensuring that the physical space of systematic murder remained as permanent testimony. The photographs and films taken under Eisenhower's orders became evidence at the Nuremberg trials, irrefutable proof that prevented historical denial. The policy of forcing German civilians to tour camps and bury the dead established a principle of accountability based on proximity, asserting that geographic nearness to atrocity created moral responsibility that could not be escaped through claims of ignorance. The lesson endured across generations. Complicity does not require active participation. It requires only silence in the face of obvious evil. The citizens of Weimar chose not to investigate the smoke they saw, not to question the smell they detected, not to acknowledge the skeletal prisoners who marched past their homes. This deliberate indifference, this cultivation of convenient ignorance, constituted a moral crime that Patton forced them to confront by making them carry the physical consequences of their inaction. The feel of decomposing flesh in their hands, the smell that would never fully wash away, served as permanent testimony to the price of complicity. Patton's statement, written in his diary on April 12 and expanded in subsequent entries, provided the definitive summary of Buchenwald's significance. Until I witnessed Buchenwald, I did not truly comprehend what we were fighting for. I believed this was a war of territory and politics, of competing national interests. I thought we fought against German military aggression, against territorial expansion. Buchenwald revealed the truth. We fight against absolute evil that has industrialized murder, that treats human beings as livestock for systematic slaughter, that applies engineering precision to genocide. I vomited for the first time in my military career, not from weakness, but from the recognition that some horrors transcend even the extensive catalog of violence I have witnessed across 2 world wars. The German civilians claim, "Wir haben es nicht gewusst," but they lived 5 kilometers from industrial murder that operated for 8 years. They saw, they smelled, they knew something. They simply chose the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of knowledge. I forced them to bury the corpses because moral accountability demands confrontation with consequences. They will carry the memory of decomposing flesh in their hands for the rest of their lives, just as I will carry the image of skeletal prisoners in the Kleines Lager for the rest of mine. This is the legacy of Buchenwald, the understanding that we fought not just a military war, but a moral crusade against a system that had transformed genocide into an industrial process. We did not know what we fought for. Now, having seen Buchenwald, we know exactly what we fought against.